Russell Warne is an educational psychologist and an expert on measuring intelligence, and he's the author of a number of books, including this one, In the Know, Debunking 35 Myths About Human Intelligence, which is the subject we're going to talk about today. So, Russell Warne, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Let's start off with the most basic question about intelligence itself. There's a lot of debate about this, I think, but can we get at least an agreement on the basic understanding of what is intelligence and how do you measure it?
Yeah, most psychologists would agree that intelligence is the general capacity to solve problems in your environment, to engage with it. In humans, that would include being able to reason, to think, to understand, to learn. In non-human animals, it would include being able to respond appropriately to the environment, to be able to make associations between stimuli and responses, etc. But I like to think of it as just this general cognitive capacity to understand the world around you, and to be able to solve problems.
Okay, I mean, someone had described it to me as the ability to recognize patterns, and the faster you can do it, the more intelligent you are. I don't know if
That
that's
yeah, that understanding, that part of it has been part of the definitions of intelligence going back to the days of Charles Spearman, the British psychologist. He made that argument over 110, 120 years ago. So
yes,
you're
you
in good
mentioned him.
company saying that's part of pattern recognition.
He figures quite largely in your book. 1904, if I remember, is the date attached to him and his
Yeah,
work.
that was Spearman's version of Einstein's miraculous year. The next year
Oh
that
yeah, yeah.
Einstein had, Spearman that same year invented factor analysis, mathematically discovered general intelligence, and in a different article, he also created a statistical correction for low reliability, and he did all this when he was still a grad student. So
Okay,
yeah,
you.
Spearman looms large. He did more before he got his PhD than I have in my career.
Well, he's you throw up a whole pile of things in that statement, and let's try and just pin down a few of them so we get a clear idea of what we're talking about. You spoke about general intelligence as opposed to, I suppose, intelligence that I spoke of. But general intelligence is a measurable quantity, I understand. It's given its own symbol, G, and it's a number which can, on average, is about 100 for most people, shall we say. Average intelligence has a G value. Okay, so how do we go about measuring that? And does it have any real significance?
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways we can measure intelligence. There are dozens, perhaps hundreds of tests out there that do so in different populations, different languages, different cultures, etc. Um, it was Charles Spearman again, and I promise this is not going to turn to a Charles Spearman fanboy podcast, but he really is such an important figure in the field. But he used the phrase "the indifference of the indicator." He hypothesized that any tasks that requires some degree of cognitive effort or work would measure intelligence to some degree. Now, that's not to say that every task measures it equally well. There are some tasks that are better than others, but it is very hard, if not impossible, to find a task that is completely unrelated to the general problem solving ability we found in people. And the way we know that is through, I used this phrase just now, factor analysis. We don't use Spearman's 120-year-old version of that anymore. We have a couple modern versions of it today. And what factor analysis does is it tells us how strongly different variables group together. And different versions of that allow us to draw the inference that, yes, these interrelations are probably caused by the same latent underlying ability. And so, no matter what tasks we give to people, might be a navigation task, it might be a vocabulary task, it might be a memorization task, whatever. Um, all of these measure that underlying intellectual ability to some degree. Um, and that's actually pretty amazing. We're really lucky in this field that so many things measure intelligence. A
Can
lot
I
of
just
things.
clarify here? I mean, I think the important point, if I've got it right, if I understand the factor analysis point, is that if you score high on one domain, like navigation, you'll also pretty likely score high on the other domains, which are um, measuring some element of intelligence. And it's because if you score high on one, you'll also score high on the others, that you can then factor them together and say, look, there's a strong correlation here. And therefore you're measuring something real, not just something, say, cultural. Have I got the picture?
Yeah, you're on the right track. In humans, all of these cognitive tasks positively correlate. You're right. People who do better on one tend to do better on others. That's a general tendency. It's not a perfect correlation. And factor analysis allows us to look into those correlations and find, okay, do they group into one big group? And they do in humans, or are there several smaller groups out there, which might be the case in some animals, for example, birds. Um, it's because there's that tendency that people who do well on one task tend to do well on the other, that we can put that data to factor analysis, and factor analysis spits out the results of, okay, there's one global ability that helps people do all these things. Factor analysis, though, does not by itself establish that a factor is real. I could invent a bicycling test, and one variable is your 1 kilometer speed. How fast can you ride a kilometer? Another variable is your ability to balance, and another variable is your 2 kilometer speed. And surprise, surprise, we have a bicycle riding factor. Well, that doesn't prove that there's something inside your brain that's solely dedicated to riding a bike. So you have to have other data, but factor analysis says, hey, these variables come together in almost everybody. Let's find out why.
Okay. So in other words, this factor, G, this value, this numerical quantitative number, is a result of a statistical operation. It's not made up by human beings or a creative mind. It's developed out of a statistical analysis of various correlations. And what
Yep.
it basically says is that there is one single number which is which enables you to draw conclusions about all these various factors because they're all correlated together. And so it
Yep.
has a mathematical foundation, not a sociological foundation. Is that fair enough?
Yeah. Yeah. And people have tried to create tests that don't produce one factor, don't produce a global factor, I should say. Um, and lo and behold, they almost always do. There's a couple of exceptions. Psychomotor things like tapping speed. How fast can you type a key repeatedly? That doesn't correlate with these. And there's certain special populations like savants or people with certain types of brain damage where it breaks down. You don't always get one global factor. But in typically developing people with tasks that are unquestionably cognitive, yeah, we have one factor, and then that means we can slap one number on it. We call that IQ. And that allows us to rank order people from most adept to solving these problems to least.
Okay. So that's what our G number does. But what would you say to the criticism of people who say, well, that's all very well, but it comes from a kind of a Western mind, a Western culture, and therefore it only is a Western concept. It wouldn't be applicable to people in different parts of the world, in Africa or China or South America or something, because it's come out of this particular area.
I think that's a very legitimate hypothesis. The first tests were created by a Frenchman. They were very quickly imported into the United States, and Great Britain and other countries. And still today, the the theoretical framework of creating these tests is very dominated by Western thought. Even when people in other cultures, psychologists in other cultures, are creating tests for their countries, they're still following the Western blueprint. So that's a very reasonable hypothesis.
But does
I
that
did
mean that the G does not measure the same thing in different countries then?
It's possible. It's a reasonable hypothesis. I did a study that came out about 6 years ago, 2008, 2019, 5 years ago, with my student Cassidy Birmingham, and we dug up archival data from economically developing non-Western nations. We purposely tried to find those countries and those cultures where it would be hardest to find G if it's just a Western artifact. And we found 97 samples, and in 94 of them, we got a G factor. My original plan was, oh, we'll find the G factor and then we'll try to figure out why it doesn't appear in some cultures. We didn't have enough samples where there wasn't G to do any sort of post hoc analysis. 94 out of 97 is pretty good batting average. And so that tells us that there is this global reasoning, problem solving ability. That being said, that doesn't mean we can ignore culture completely. The ability inside the head, there might be something biologically building human brains to solve problems in a bunch of different contexts or scenarios, but the manifestations of that ability can still be culturally specific. And so there's a very well-known study from the 70s, of it's one of the native peoples of Liberia, where they did excellent ethnographic work on these people's problem solving abilities. And if you gave them some objects, cooking utensils and a pot, and a broom, and other things that belong in a kitchen, if you had tools on the table and then a piece of meat, the people would say, oh, the odd item out is the broom because you use all these other things to cook. And they wouldn't categorize the way Westerners do, who would obviously say, oh, the food's the odd item out. Everything else belongs in the kitchen. But give them plants from the local area, they can very quickly classify them into trees and vines and bushes. So they can still classify, but the manifestation of that is culturally specific. And so, yeah, they do poorly on Western tests. It's not because they're dumb, it's because the Western stimuli and content is unfamiliar. And I do horrible in classifying plants from their environment. It's a two-way street.
So, if I can understand, just to clarify what you're saying, as you go from place to place, as you go from country to country, as you go from continent to continent, there are cultural differences between these groups of people. But despite those cultural differences, there is within them an invariant, which you can call general intelligence, which is present in all of those cultures, despite the cultural differences. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. I am, though, understandably, as a scientist, I am willing to say, if someone presents strong data that there is a culture out there that doesn't um, have this result, then I'm willing to say, okay, it's not a cultural universal. Like I said, I found three
Okay,
data sets where
but we need to see the evidence for that, is what you're
we
saying.
need to see the evidence. It needs to be replicable. I'm extremely skeptical that we'll find a culture out there that doesn't have a general intelligence
So what you're
module.
saying is so far we haven't found one.
So far, we haven't found one that's replicable, and the cross species data is so strong. We have found general intelligence in every mammal species ever investigated. It's
Mm.
in dogs, it's in primates, it's in, you know, oh, I read a study recently. I can't remember what animal, but it seems like there's a new genus every 6 months for someone. Someone found general intelligence. I'm extremely skeptical that it exists in all these mammal species and in most humans, but not this human group out there, because we're far more closely related to one another as humans than we are to dogs or
Yeah.
apes. I find it extraordinarily
I was going to
difficult.
sum it up that way, that there's more that unites us, or some central elements which definitely unite us as human beings, wherever we happen to be, than
Exactly.
divides
And
us.
so evolutionarily, general intelligence probably emerged with the earliest mammals or earlier in our evolutionary history. Stuff that fundamental in a taxon like mammals does not just get discarded over the course of 10, 20,000 years.
And we sit at the pinnacle of all of that. Okay, let me having spoke about evolution and the can I ask you about the origins of intelligence now? Because I think there was, if I understand it correctly, two main schools of thought. One is that intelligence is determined by nature, by genetics, by your DNA essentially, and the other one is that no, the human being is more of a blank slate, and intelligence and whatever it is that goes up to make that is determined by your environment, by nurture, by your family, by the things. Which of those two is correct?
That's almost a trick question. They're both correct. Just as with many other traits, phenotypes in humans and in animals, you need both environment and genes. If Mozart didn't have some genes to encourage that made him musically adept, then all the piano lessons and beatings from his father in the world weren't going to turn into a musical genius. Conversely, if we could clone Mozart and then raise him in a closet without any exposure to music, he won't be a musical genius. You need both.
Okay,
Um,
let me put the question the other way round then.
yeah.
Can you determine general intelligence purely by environment? In other words, what do you make of the blank slate hypothesis that you pick up everything by nurture? Is that valid or viable?
Um, a pure blank slate perspective, no. We know for a fact that genes do matter. Assuming a person is raised in a non-neglectful environment in a middle or high income country, um, then genes are part of the reason why some people seem to be smarter than others. Um, but like I said, environment does have its place. One of the best ways we know how to raise intelligence is to send people to school. Um, and I have children. My oldest is 10. Um, I'm amazed at how even a little exposure to school, formal schooling, can rapidly increase a child's problem solving ability and school's environment. Um, but that doesn't nullify genetic influence, and genes don't nullify environmental influence. Um,
Which is the biggest factor as far as you're concerned?
in children, environment seems to matter more, and these are studies coming out of mostly wealthy countries where almost everyone has enough access to enough food, and there's not a civil war going on. So assuming you're in a stable environment that you would get from a wealthy country, environment matters more in children. And then starting at about age 10 or 11, it's about 50-50. And then by adolescence and adulthood, genes matter more for determining, I don't want to say determining, for influencing rank order in intelligence.
Okay, so
Um,
if I'm an adult, even a young adult, an adolescent, can I increase my intelligence by training?
yeah, keep going to school. Don't drop out
No,
as
I'm talking
early as
about
you can.
after school times. I mean, if now I'm an adult, can I increase my intelligence by training?
Um, for people growing up in non-neglectful environments in wealthy countries, we do not know of any method to permanently raise intelligence in adolescents or adults.
Right.
Um, in fact, we don't even know for sure how to do it in children. We know that sending kids to school helps. Um, we do know that adoption raises IQ, assuming you're being adopted out of an unfavorable environment in a wealthy country into a favorable home environment in a wealthy country. It seems to raise IQ by about 3 points, give or take. Adoption does. But we don't know what adoptive parents are doing that makes their adopted children smarter than they would have been if they had stayed home. We don't know if it's the better healthcare. We
Okay,
don't know if
let
it's
me try and pin this down a little bit more tightly. And I've got
okay.
this question here should do it, I hope. That is, can everybody achieve the same level of intelligence with the right education?
No, we do know that for sure. That's not there. Now, that being said, we don't know what a given person's limits are. And I think everyone should have access to the best possible education they should get.
Yeah, yeah.
But um, I have someone whom I care about very dearly in my wife's family who has some limitations. And there's no way on earth this person is ever going to learn calculus. At my current job, I'm working with people whose IQs are between 81 and 92, so below average, but not abnormally so. And all of them are getting an intensive educational program. They're all being given the same intensive educational program. And there are some of them on the lower end who are not passing the final exams, despite their hard work, despite the program they're subjected to. Um, so we do know that there are limits. The
Well,
higher
that
the
definitely
IQ,
puts the
the
nail
higher
in
the
the
limit
coffin
can
of the blank slate idea, then, doesn't it? If you can't get to the same level as everybody else.
Yeah, it really does very much undermine the blank slate. Um, and I've seen people try very mighty to, adults to master middle school math, and it's very difficult if your IQ is 80.
I've just
Um,
retired and I'm trying to master the piano. And I think I have a ceiling as well, but that's a different matter, I think. Entirely.
yeah.
Let me pin you down even further because you've got a chapter in this book, and the question based on this chapter 18 is every child gifted?
Definitely not. I actually got into this field because I started out as a gifted education researcher.
No.
Um, no. Um,
But every
now,
parent thinks their own child is gifted.
yeah, if you ask parents, then yes, every one of their children's gifted. Yeah, honestly, I see why that the myth that every child is gifted is so seductive, especially to Americans who very much love egalitarianism. And I'm like that too. I love
Well,
egalitarianism.
it's the foundation of the American dream that anyone can be from anywhere can become the president of the United States. I mean, if you've got
Yeah,
Donald Trump as the president, well, I mean, that shows anyone can make it.
yeah, exactly. And a lot of people very much want to believe that every child is gifted. Every child could master calculus if just given the right teacher, the right, etc. But no, it's not true. There are limits. Even within a family, there are differences. Anyone with siblings can often point out the child in their family who excels the most academically and who struggles the most. Um, there are limits. We don't always know how they were placed there. Genetics is probably part of it. Environment's probably some of it too, sometimes. Um, but no, not every child excels at a level where you can, in good conscience, call them gifted.
Okay, so bad news for some parents, but I mean, I suppose that's simply a recognition of what you would call the bell curve, that people lie on a distribution of
Mhm.
natural gifts, and
Yep.
some are sovereignly given a great pile of gifts, and some are not, unfortunately. But that's just life as it is. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, and it is an unfortunate. I mean, life isn't fair.
Yeah, yeah.
It is an
That's
unfortunate.
one of the things
Again,
we've got to
here
cope
comes
with.
my egalitarianism coming out. No, it's not fair, especially when you also consider that you know doing well in one area, these people also tend to do well in others. The math whiz tends to also excel in the writing course in school and the science course. And then, as if that weren't unfair enough, they're more likely to come from middle and upper class families, and they're also more likely to be taller. I mean, like there's even physical things that no one thinks are related to IQ. They still correlate with it anyway. And you know what? Life's not fair. I wish I were 6'2" with an IQ of 140 and good looks to match, but no, other people got that. I wasn't dealt
I'm
as good
sure
of
you're
a.
not far off any of those items, Russell. But let me ask you then about society and its the impact of intelligence on our social connections, particularly in jobs, for example. Everyone has to do a job. Is intelligence relevant to most jobs or not relevant to most jobs?
Intelligence is, yes, relevant to most jobs. And the
Not to
more
every job.
there are very few exceptions, and even then, there's not strong data completely disproving the hypothesis that intelligence matters for that job. I think of things like um, professional athletes. We have the best data from the National Football League here in the United States because they give a short 12-minute intelligence test to all potential recruits. Um, and there are some positions on the American football field where intelligence doesn't seem to matter. The big burly guy on the front lines blocking to protect the quarterback or blocking to protect the rusher. That doesn't seem to be related to intelligence. Um, I suspect that there are some extremely low skill jobs about meat packing, for example, um, that it might not be relevant. And then possibly things like being a professional singer, things where it's all about performance. Even then, there's some days I'm not sure that
I
IQ.
I do recall reading somewhere that the army would give intelligence tests to new recruits. And if they were below a certain level, and if my memory serves me well, it was like 85 out of the normal 100, then they would reject them on the grounds that there was no job which they could give them for which they would be suitable. I don't know if that corresponds with anything you're aware of? Or
Yeah, in the United States, in the 50s,
that's right. It's
Congress
at
passed
that
a
time.
law that still stands, saying that no one below the 10th percentile, which is about 80,
Eight.
can enlist in the armed forces. Before that, during the Korean War and World War II and even World War One, they did accept people that low. Um, and then even though Congress says that's the minimum, sometimes depending on personnel staffing needs, the different branches of the military might set their minimum even higher. Um, in the Army right now, the minimum is the 16th percentile, which is an IQ of 84. I think in the Navy, it's roughly in the same territory. In the Air Force, it's higher. Um, but yeah, the thought is not necessarily there's no job available for you, but it's often that the training takes longer, you're more expensive to train, um, there's more attrition. And so there's often this trade off. How many people do we need? Do we need a monkey with the minimum? But Congress has said, at least in the United States, 10th percentile, IQ of 80. That's as low as we can go.
Right.
Um,
And that
there's,
must
yeah,
be a reflective of the wider employment um, community where people are offering jobs. Presumably, they would be similarly disbarred from a whole range of jobs. Clearly, I mean, it makes sense, doesn't
yeah,
it? Even an average
yeah,
IQ person, you wouldn't want them to be in a job like, I don't know, a neurosurgeon. You'd want someone
mhm,
with a high level of not just skill, but also intelligence, I would think, problem
yeah.
solving. Uh,
Exactly. Now, not every employer is giving a test to applicants before they hire them, but there there are definitely screeners. Often in the United States, we say, "Oh, you have to have a high school diploma. Oh, you need to have some college experience. You have a college diploma," and that is an indirect screener for IQ. Um, but yes, in most jobs, you would rather have a smarter employee than a less intelligent one. And you gave the example of neurosurgery. That's an obvious high stakes example. But even a server at a restaurant, a smarter server is less likely to mess up the order. They're less likely to drop a glass that that breaks and they have to then buy a replacement.
yeah.
They're more attentive to your customers' needs. Um, I will say, from the employer's perspective, there are sometimes exceptions when you might not want the smartest person out there. Smarter people tend to have more career opportunities. So if you keep hiring the smartest person, there might be some jobs where you have more turnover.
Yeah.
And because they have more career opportunities, smarter people often negotiate for more pay. And if that marginal higher pay is not worth getting a couple more IQ points out of your employee, it might be worth it not to take the smartest person.
Yeah.
Um, so you can't just look at it as a simple, oh, smarter is always better. No, there are situations for employers where you might be willing to make that trade-off. You don't need a IQ 120 delivery driver working for the post office.
And maybe there are other factors here. I know that in psychology, there's different models of personality, where
Mhm.
intelligence is one factor of personality, and there may be other factors such as conscientiousness, for
Oh,
example.
yes,
And conscientiousness might be the thing you're really looking for, rather than intelligence, say in a particular kind of job. That maybe intelligence is not
definitely.
the overriding factor, but rather conscientiousness might be. That might,
Definitely. And the job counseling research is one of the strongest areas of psychology. For a person to be a good fit for the job, yes, they have to have the cognitive wherewithal to be able to do the job, but that's not enough. You're right. Personality traits can often matter. Personal interests often matter, and values. Um, so yeah, there are times. A good example as a salesperson. I want a very extroverted, friendly salesperson, and I'm willing to sacrifice 5 or 10 IQ points to
Yeah.
get that outgoing, gregarious, friendly salesperson pushing my product.
So employers might be looking for 5 different traits and a mixture of different elements of those rather than just one. So, got you.
Yeah, intelligence seems to matter for almost every job. Conscientiousness and extroversion matter for a lot of jobs, but not
Yeah.
all. And neuroticism for some.
Yeah.
And then interests matter a
Yeah.
lot too. If you only find yourself selecting for one, you're not always going to find the best
You might
employees.
not be. Okay. Let me move us on to some slightly more controversial issues, because this is not an area without controversy, is it? This whole matter of intelligence, as Charles Murray might have reminded us. Um, let me ask you about, what does the science and the results say about the differences between male and female IQ tests on average?
Yeah, this is a point of not just controversy in society about the field, but this is a major point of controversy within the field. My view is that there's probably no average difference between male and females in countries that educate their females. All
Yeah.
bets are off in Afghanistan and
Yeah.
places like that. Um, and so I do have some colleagues who believe that there is a slight male advantage in adulthood. I've looked at a lot of those studies and I'm not convinced. I don't think the sampling is representative enough to draw strong conclusions. If there is a male advantage, we're talking about in the neighborhood of 1 to 3 IQ points. But I don't think the evidence is strong enough for that. I think if it were really consistent.
It's probably the same. But what about the spread?
Yeah. The spread, now that's where the differences are really interesting. Um, you don't notice it in daily life, but if you have a very large sample or if you're working with people at the extremes, you do. Males seem to have more variability. There's more males with very low intelligence than there are females, and there seem to be more males with very high intelligence than there are females with that. Um, it's the standard deviation difference is about 10%. So males spread is about 10% more. You don't notice this in your daily life, but if you do work with brighter than average people or people with more mental disabilities, you do. And sometimes the difference is very extreme. And the further you get out from average, the more imbalanced this looks. Um, I think one of the most visible places you see it is in TV quiz shows. In the United States, we have Jeopardy, and males are about 60% of contestants, and they win
Yeah.
70% of games. And even the female contestant with the most wins is actually transgender. She is biologically male.
Ah. Mm.
Yeah, and their male contestant with the most wins has something like over 3 times more wins than the biologically female contestant with the most wins. It's not even
Okay, so
close.
to put this in a slightly different context, but the same area, are you saying that in the field of extreme human intelligence, let's measure that by Nobel Prize winning people, most of those are male by a long, long way? Now, many people would say that's because females have never had the advantages in many educational areas that males have had, and that explains the imbalance. But is it true that you're saying that actually, no, there's an inbuilt difference here which would predispose more males to win more Nobel Prize than females? Have I understood you? Have I not?
Yeah, I would like to clarify that I do think that there are environmental
Hmm.
characteristics that might make it more difficult for females to win more Nobels. I don't think that they come close to fully explaining the difference. I do think that this variability difference is partially non-environmental, though. In fact, it's probably mostly non-environmental. If you look in personality, um, males have more variability. We have more male serial killers, and we also have more male clergy. Like,
That's
um,
interesting too.
yeah, I mean,
Most of the prisons are full of males rather than females.
exactly. We have um, in interests also um, much more variability within an interest. Within a given topic, you tend to have more males who have zero interest in it and extreme interest. One thing about interest I do think partially explains this is that, um, and this goes against the greater variability in general, but if you count the number of interests, number of hobbies, number of topics people are interested in, number of ways people want to spend their time, males tend to be more focused. Males have fewer hobbies, they have fewer, when they go to college, they jump around less before they pick a major. Women tend to want to spend their time doing a lot of different things. They want to
Right.
spend time with friends, they want to spend time with alone hobbies, they want to spend time at work, they want to spend time with family. Um, and so I think that that's probably a big piece of it
You're saying
because
these are innate differences between males and females, not
yeah,
culturally determined.
yeah, I don't know where that innateness comes from. I don't know if it's genetic, I don't know if it's biological or what, but allow people to spend their time how they want, and males will obsess more about individual areas. And if that comes to a career, if you're a scientist, bright males are more likely to want to spend 80, 90, 100 hours a week in the lab.
Yeah. Or even
Women are less likely
in high-powered
to do that.
jobs, maybe as well, where some people may not want to do that.
Exactly. I think that's one of the reasons why there might be more entrepreneur
Yeah.
men.
Let me
Um,
push you. We're running out of time, and there's a couple of important questions I wanted to get through. Some even more controversial than that. But the next one I wanted to ask, and I was thinking of ducking this, but I think just for the sake of the scientific completeness, I ought to ask it. And that is, are there racial differences in IQ? And if so, what's the significance of that, if any?
well, no one disputes that the IQ numbers have different averages across groups. The dispute is why and what that means. And that's where you get the controversy.
Yeah.
The
So
best,
there are differences, but we don't know what the cause of that is, and the possibilities are what?
well, the best studied group differences are across racial groups within the United States. We do have some data from Great Britain and other countries that have a lot of racial mixture, or like South Africa, Brazil, but U.S. and UK we have the best data. Within the U.S., I think the evidence is pretty strong that there's a partially genetic reason, but I don't think the evidence is strong enough to say how strong the genes are.
Hmm.
You asked me earlier, oh, for children or adults, which one matters more, genes or environment? I could say, oh, for kids it's environment, for adults it's genes. We don't have that level of evidence when talking about racial groups in the US, or the UK, let alone other countries. I think that we know it's more than zero, but for all I know, 3% of these differences might be genetic, or it might be 30 or 83. I don't know.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
I have read, and I don't know if it's valid or not, but they you know, tend to be those from China, Japan, those kind of areas have a slightly higher IQ than those in the West. And I was surprised to find again, if this is correct or not, you can put me right if I'm wrong, that the highest group who had 10 to 15 points more were Ashkenazi Jews, who seem to be scoring very highly on IQ tests. Does that correspond with your understanding of the data, or is it something different from that?
Yeah, Ashkenazi Jews seem to have the highest average. I don't know if it hits 10 or 15 points. I think 5 to 10 points
Oh,
higher than
yeah.
the European average.
I might have misremembered.
Yeah, there's different people with different estimates. And yes, East Asians, it seems to be about 3 to 5 point higher mean compared to the European average. Which, by the way, if you'll allow me to indulge myself, um, there's sometimes the criticism that intelligence tests and this whole field is a white supremacist field. If it is, they've done a horrible job at it, because Jews and East Asians beat Europeans in almost every study for the
Yes,
past
I know.
100 years.
I mean, I was going to ask you a question about. I mean, the bigger question here is, what is your view on those people who say that this kind of research should not be done, or if it is done, it shouldn't be made public because it can be misused by bad actors of different kinds? That research should be not looked at in certain sensitive areas. What's your view?
I would say ignorance is not bliss. And instead, I would say, let's transport ourselves back in time 150 years and say, Mr. Darwin, what do you say to those people who think that we shouldn't do research into biological evolution because that could endanger people's faith in religion, and it could be used by bad actors who want to undermine the church? Or, you know, more recent, um, what would you say to someone who says, maybe we shouldn't, hey, Mr. Sociologist, we shouldn't study social class. Look at how many millions of deaths have come from communism. We shouldn't study social class because bad actors might use that information, and look how awful it's been. So I say, no, ignorance is not bliss.
Yeah.
The assumption should be that there should be unfettered, open scientific inquiry. That being said, you need to be diplomatic. And I, for several years, taught this at a university with a large racial minority student population. And I saw firsthand that, yes, you can teach this controversial subject diplomatically, with respect, and not have the world start to burn. I do think that there are people who could be more diplomatic, but I don't think that we shouldn't research something out of fear for what a bad actor might do with it. If we had done that, in my country, the Unabomber was bombing universities and um, computer businesses in the 80s and early 90s because he was a Luddite and didn't like technology. We shouldn't have shut down research on computers just because one nut job was blowing people up. We shouldn't shut down scientific inquiry into any topic, even if there is a bad actor out there that it might trigger.
We need to learn to be grown up in handling what we learn, I suppose. We're coming to the end of our very interesting conversation, and I want to direct your attention for my last question towards the future. How does this work on intelligence look like things are unfolding for the future? There are two areas which come to mind. One is, I've heard of something called the Flynn effect, which seems to indicate that as time goes on and as we look forward into the future, we're getting more and more intelligent. And that suggests that, IQ is rising across the board in different areas, which case is that a good thing? Though on the other hand, I have read books. There's one called at our wits' end, which suggests that actually intelligence is declining as time goes on. I wonder, as you look to the future, is there a change in intelligence or not? IQ.
Well, no one knew the future. No one knows the future completely. If they did, I would use that ability to invest in the stock market,
Is there a
not write
trend
articles on the flynn
from,
effect.
from the past that we can take into the future?
Yeah, we do know that throughout the 20th century, in every country where it's been investigated, where the data survive, where we can investigate this. Yes, we saw average IQ increase. In the United States, it's been about 3 points per decade. That seems to be really common in Western nations, which tells you that from the mid 1910s, when these tests were good enough that you got a global IQ number, to the mid 1990s. Wow, that was a 24-point IQ boost. 24 points is a lot.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
the difference from average to low genius level, or from someone who struggles to hold down a job to being
We
average.
don't seem to notice that change in society, though, I would say.
Exactly. This is why it was so puzzling when James Flynn publicized it originally in the 80s. Because if you then extrapolate it backwards, you start saying, huh, wait a minute, at the time of the American Revolution, the average IQ would have been so low that most humans wouldn't have been able to go to the bathroom by themselves or learn how to talk.
So do
Clearly, that wasn't the case. Yeah, and
you,
you go back further in Shakespeare's day, no one
no other, do you
knew
believe
how
in the
to.
Flynn effect then? Is that on the cards for you or not?
Well, we do know that the rise in IQ is real, but since James Flynn publicized it in the mid 80s, we've learned that the increase in IQ is real, but it's not an increase in G. And now we're coming full circle. What is
Oh,
going
can you
up is
clarify the
people.
difference between IQ and G? Because I always thought they were roughly the same, but that's not the case.
Well, G is the psychological ability in your head. IQ is the number we're using to measure it. And
Okay. But doesn't G
usually you
have it?
don't need a distinction, but when you're talking about the Flynn effect, you have to distinguish.
Okay, all right.
The number's going up. And that's because the more specific abilities than general intelligence, more narrow things like verbal ability, like processing speed, those are increasing. And so, yeah, we are better than our grandparents were at solving formal problems. That doesn't mean we're smarter than them.
Unfortunately.
Um, yeah, unfortunately. And so that's how we've been able to square that circle of, wait a minute, how did IQ go up so much if we aren't noticeably smarter? Um,
Have the goalposts moved? Are we
yes,
measuring
they have on the
different
test.
things?
Yes. More recent tests, you have to answer a lot more questions correct to be average than you did 30, 50, 80 years
Yeah.
ago. And James Flint, whom I wish were still with us. I loved and respected the man so much. He gave the example. He was a distance runner. That was one of his passions and his hobbies. He said, if you look at data, there's more people than ever who have run marathons, and among elite runners, world record times keep dropping. Um, Clearly we haven't been bred to run smarter in the past 50 years, 100 years. What is it? Well, it's an environmental effect. Better running shoes, better training regimens, a more positive culture about this. And James Flynn is okay with these other contributing factors making us faster without our general physical ability changing. And that's probably what's going on with IQ going up.
So maybe there's hope in the future for us to engineer our environment to make things a whole lot better, not only for the world around us, but for ourselves too, and our understanding.
I hope so.
Russell, Warne, thank you ever so much for your time, for a fascinating conversation. Can I recommend this book, In the Know, 35 Myths About Human Intelligence? I can genuinely say that I don't know a better book on an introduction or looking at the issues surrounding intelligence. It's certainly worth getting. And the great advantage of it, I've found, is that every chapter is kind of independent of the others. You can dip into it wherever you like. It's not sequential in that respect. You don't need to do it that way. So thoroughly recommended. In the Know by Russell T. Warne. Russell, thank you once again for your time.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
I would have liked to have asked you one last question, but time escaped us, and that was to do with artificial intelligence and how that seems to be rapidly ramping up. I don't know if people are measuring artificial intelligence in the same way that they're measuring human intelligence, but it'd be interesting to know where it stands at the moment. And when it gets to that point, maybe when it, 10 times, 100 times what our own intelligence is, and then where are we, So,
Yeah, I actually wrote an article about artificial and human intelligence. It's in Skeptic magazine. You can look it up. I want to say it came out in May or so, about 6 months ago. There are people administering intelligence tests to AIs.
I suppose that makes
Um,
sense. What are they finding?
um, Depending on the task, sometimes they are either hugely outperforming humans or they have a long ways to go. Um, AI models are not showing the positive manifold, that positive intercorrelation among all abilities, the way that humans and other animals do. Um, and
Interesting.
yeah, and then am almost certain that some of the scores we get on these when these tests are administered, I'm almost certain that some of them are inflated. The data scientists and the AI engineers call it data leakage.
Right.
When you train the model on data and then information, and then it's asked about that same data later. And so, a good example is vocabulary. These AI models blow humans out of the water, and
Well, I
and
would.
I'm
Absolutely.
yeah, and I'm actually building an intelligence test right now, and there's some words on it that I would have no idea if I hadn't looked them up in the dictionary.
I think there were 240 odd thousand words in the Oxford English Dictionary.
Yeah,
And the standard vocabulary is, well, for a university person, about 20,000, something like that.
and
Um,
it's so easy to plug all 240,000 of those words into the AI model, and then surprise, surprise,
yeah.
when
It's
when
going to
you
blow.
give them a question about that exact word, one of those
Uh,
words,
my
they
own
do
view
well.
is that I think there's probably a more fundamental problem between measuring AI and human intelligence. It's called AI. And that is, I'm not even sure that we're measuring the same thing.
No, we're
We
not.
call it intelligence in each case, but we're using large language models in one instance, and we're not using large language models in the other instance. It's a different kind of thing at root, I think it is anyway. We're not operating on the same kind of algorithm, so it may not even be intelligence that we're measuring. Some kind of mimicry or some kind. I don't know what it would be, but
Yeah,
if we're not
my
measuring the same thing,
colleague, I'm trying to look up who it was. My colleague, I don't know how to say his last name, Gills Gignac, Gignac. He has an amazing article out about this. And he makes a very convincing argument that no, that they're not measuring the same thing.
yeah, I'm not surprised.
Um,
That would be my gut feeling about it. But Russell, I have kept you far too long. I did say I would finish within the hour. I've gone a bit over that, but we started a little bit late
yeah.
anyway. But thank you ever so much for your time.